Hello and welcome back to the Pole Position. I've just reached over 200 subscribers, and as promised I'll be doing this unscripted video to share my thoughts on the channel and recent elections. So, let's get started. So this channel started roughly about 6 months ago, and it was pretty much in reaction to the UK general election. When Sunak announced the election and announced the day, I got to work, making videos, and I really just wanted to share my thoughts on the polling and the more technical side of elections rather than the politics itself. This is because I thought that the technical aspects of elections, the polling and the numbers, doesn't get talked about a lot in news. So I figured I'd try to fill that gap up a little. So, I started off publishing videos. They weren't really getting that many views until my first video to break 1,000 views, my video on the election in England specifically, because I figured I wanted to address each individual nation on their own, because they all have sort of different politics. Northern Ireland has different parties, Scotland has the SNP, Wales has Plaid Cymru, and I figured that giving each nation their own attention would sort of paint a better picture for the UK nationally, because we often just hear Labour versus Conservative or Lib Dem versus Conservative, and there's a lot of focus specifically on the very big picture that we often don't get to go into that much detail about the different regions. So that's why I did it that way. I released my most popular video, which was on Northern Ireland. I was very surprised at that, but it got over 12,000 views, so, very pleased with that. And I also released my predictions, which were okay, generally speaking. There were a few off, so I slightly overestimated the SNP and slightly underestimated the Lib Dems and Reform, but generally just by a few seats. So I was generally quite proud with my predictions. The UK general election was very interesting to cover, and I'll be getting into more depth about that later in the video. But first, I have to say I'm really pleased with how the channel's gone. As I said in my last video, if you'd have told me that I was going to reach 200 subscribers in 6 months, I would have been a bit skeptical. But I'm absolutely thrilled to have this many people subscribing and watching my videos, and it does mean a lot. I've also built up my social media base, so I've started using Twitter. I know, not exactly the most controversy-free of websites, but what isn't these days? And that's been really good with building up my base. And I've opened an Instagram account, but I'm still sort of trying to get my footing. An idea I've had is that I could use my Instagram account to create short videos, sort of like YouTube Shorts, and I could post them both on YouTube and Instagram. So that's what I'm thinking of using for that. So I'll be doing stuff like that pretty soon. So definitely keep an eye out. So, 200 subscribers, 202, if we're being exact, and I'm hoping to branch out in terms of the content that I produce, hoping to do more kind of fact-based commentary style videos, so kind of providing more than just the raw numbers, but what's kind of driving those numbers. What drives people to vote a certain way, what drives them what drives the electorate, really, what motivates the electorate, and what gets people out to vote. So, I've been experimenting a bit with the kind of content I'm making. I did one on Labour's 100-ish days in office and whether or not they're in trouble. and that video did all right. And I've also been sort of trying to expand beyond just UK politics. So I've done tons of videos on the US now. Not going to see many videos on the US in the near future as things sort of die down and other elections begin to take over. But that's been a lot of fun, and that's helped grow my base a little bit. And so that's where this channel is right now. I'm not working with a lot here. It's pretty much just me doing this in my spare time, and I do definitely want to up the quality of my videos, and I'm hoping to do that as time goes on. But it really means a lot that I've gotten this far just making videos and just speaking to a microphone, and that really does mean a lot. So thank you for watching my videos, and thank you for subscribing if you have. If you haven't, that's fine, that's your choice, but I would really like it if you do subscribe. It does help a lot. Anyway, on to the next part. So we've had a lot of elections this year, I'm not going to lie. It's believed that we have had a world record for the number of people who have voted this year. So that's a really exciting thing in my view. I think it is really exciting to see more and more elections taking place. I think that is a really good thing. Yes, some of the elections are generally considered sham elections. Russia, for instance, it's pretty clear who is going to win that. Despite votes being cast, it was generally not seen as free and fair. So there is that caveat to keep in mind, but there has still been plenty of fully democratic elections going on this year. We've had two of the world's largest democracies, both India and the US, having their say. We've also had the EU elections, so basically the whole European Union went to the polls to elect their representatives to the European Parliament. We've had a big election in Moldova that I'll get into, and we've also had elections. So, for example, we had the legislative election in South Korea and the general election in Japan. So that's really exciting. And we've also got some future elections coming up. So today, as I'm recording this, the people of Ireland are going to the polls to vote in their new parliament. And it's right now pretty much an even split between the three big parties. We'll get into that in a bit. I know I'm saying that a lot. And we also have the German elections. The coalition between the FDP, the SPD, and the Greens in Germany has collapsed. And so the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he called a general election, and that's going to happen, I believe, in January. And there's also the Romanian election, I believe that's happening on December 1st. And that should be very interesting to see the results. So, what are the kind of trends that we have seen? Well, we do hear a lot about the rise of more right-wing parties. So, for example, in France, despite not necessarily winning the largest number of seats in the French Parliament, the National Rally did manage to win the largest number of votes and still improved their seat share massively from previous elections. They're generally seen as pretty hard right. In Germany, we have the Alternative für Deutschland, and it's looking like they're going to do well out of this election, though maybe not as well, and whether or not they actually get in on coalition talks is generally up in the air. I'm not going to make any predictions on that one. And we've also seen America. We've seen the return of Donald Trump, and in the UK, we've seen the rise in support for Reform UK, going from 2% of the vote, I believe, in 2019, back when they were the Brexit Party, to, I believe, 14% of the vote UK-wide. So that's a pretty big deal. Certainly a big achievement for a third party. And so generally there is this sense that there is a rightward shift in the world. But I would argue that there's another element to this beyond simply just a rightward shift, and that rather it is generally a shift that sours, that there's generally a souring attitude to incumbents or to incumbent administrations. And the result of that has often led to the rise of right-wing populist parties, but also in some instances to quite hard left parties and political figures. So, for example, France, the Emmanuel Macron's Ensemble Alliance did pretty poorly in the legislative elections, and they lost a ton of seats to both the National Rally, but also the New Popular Front, which is a left-wing alliance that is led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's generally seen as quite to the left of mainstream French politics. So he's sort of represents the more hard left-wing element that's also seeing a rise in popularity. But that is just one example. But on the point of anti-incumbent votes, we've had the UK, where the Labour Party managed to win a huge victory, not necessarily in vote share, but in seats share. They absolutely swept the board. That's a very interesting how that happened. Go watch my UK video on the results if you want to know more about that. But suffice it to say, it was a majority that was broad but shallow. So broad as in it was quite geographically wide, but shallow as in it was lots of seats with very small majorities. And so we've also had Japan and South Korea, both with incumbent governments that were conservative. Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the main conservative party, lost its majority for the first time in, I think, over a decade, with plenty of opponents gaining ground, both the centrist constitutional Democrats, but also the Ishin Party, that's a bit hard to pin down ideologically, but it's generally seen as sort of libertarian in outlook. So that's quite interesting. With South Korea, centrist and left-wing opponents managed to win the legislative chamber quite decisively. They aren't in government because they have a presidential system, so the president is still the head of government, and they won't have a presidential election till 2027. So that'll take a bit of time before there's an election that could result in a change of government. And we've also had some incumbent successes this year. So, for example, Moldova, the incumbent president Maya Sandu managed to win quite decisively against her more Eurosceptic opponent. So that's one example of a successful incumbent managing to hold on. But I'd also say that is maybe just a product of Moldovan politics, specifically due to the position they're in with Ukraine and the general eagerness amongst some of the population to join the EU. So that may not be part of a wider trend, but it's just worth noting. We also had the Indian elections, where Modi's BJP party actually lost its majority. So the overall coalition alliance, the National Democratic Alliance it's called, which the BJP is the main leader, they still managed to win. Pretty firmly, but the opposition did make significant gains, and so it's a little more difficult for the BJP to maintain a strong foothold on the Indian Parliament. It still resulted in them holding power. They still maintained their hold on the premiership, but it was still a pretty bad result considering how well they had done in previous elections. Finally, we have the US election. Now, this one was very interesting because for the first time in 20 years, a Republican has managed to win the popular vote in a presidential race, not just winning the Electoral College vote. So that's a pretty big deal. It's certainly a very good night for the Republicans, a much better night than most people were expecting. Donald Trump managed to win all 7 swing states, and even won in areas he didn't win in 2016. So, for example, Monroe County and Bucks County in Pennsylvania, they voted for Trump this election when they had previously voted for both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. Democrats failed to hold on to many of the groups that were shifting away from them, and they also failed to make significant gains in the areas they needed to win in order to hold the presidency. So that was quite interesting, the result, because Donald Trump's lead in the popular vote isn't that big. It's just under 2 points. So it's definitely not a landslide, but it is still a very firm and convincing victory. So it's I wouldn't count it as a landslide, but I'd also not count it as slim as possible, because it was definitely quite a firm victory. I predicted that Kamala would win, and I was wrong. And I'm happy to admit I was wrong because, it was just a prediction. The interesting thing about American politics is that I've often found that the polls can be quite unusual at times. And what I mean by unusual is they can often have polls that indicate one thing, and then something else entirely happens. So, for example, there was the Ann Seltzer poll, generally seen as one of the most reliable polls in the country, and that was specifically polling the state of Iowa. Now, prior to the election, that poll put Kamala Harris at 4 points ahead in the state of Iowa, which, of course, she ended up losing by over 10. So there are a lot of outliers in polls, and I've often found that there are a lot of issues with American polling. For example, there's a lot of polls that were funded by campaigns. So the Nebraska Senate race I found really hard to pin down because a lot of the polls that we were getting were polls from the campaigns or paid for by the campaigns. So that kind of, in my view, damages some of the reliability of these polls. And you also have groups like Trafalgar who don't publish their crosstabs. So that's another issue that I think you do need to publish all of the data. You need to properly collect data. You need to publish it in full, and you need to make it very clear the different demographics that make up your survey. And that's to ensure that the information that you're presenting is balanced, properly weighted, and proportionate roughly to the population. And in the end, polls often get it wrong. and that's just the reality, that polls aren't always the best indicators at an election. They don't predict the future. They're just a form of data collection that really just leads you to come to conclusions based on the data that you interpret. Am I disappointed? Yes, I am disappointed, not because of the election result itself, but just that I got it wrong. Who wouldn't be? But this has been a very interesting learning experience for me. It's got me to rethink my methods, and there were definitely plenty of signs that showed that Donald Trump was going to win, and I also did stress that the election was close and it could swing either way. But no, this is a very interesting election. I had a lot of fun watching it on election night, watching all the numbers come in, and you know what? This is just a learning experience. The key thing now is to assess. It's to analyze, it's to break down the numbers and figure out where to go from here. So yeah, that's kind of what I've taken from the presidential election. It is generally, from the numbers that I've seen and the information that has come out in terms of the exit polls, that generally tend to be much more reliable in my experience. I found the exit polls are pretty good. They generally tell us that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with how things are in the US, and things like the economy was kind of the main one. The economy is generally always seen as the deciding factor. I believe it was James Carville, a Bill Clinton strategist, who said in 1992, "It's the economy, stupid." So yeah, that was definitely quite telling. And I think it shows a bit of what I was saying about the incumbent dissatisfaction. So Joe Biden had pretty low approval ratings. He was definitely not a particularly popular president going into this election. And Kamala Harris was the vice president in his administration. And so people looked at that and said that she's part of the administration, so what is she going to change if she was a key part of this? So yeah, that's my take on why she lost. Though I'd also say generally that the fact that there was no open primary made it a little more difficult, because it was seen that she didn't necessarily have the mandate from her party, whereas Donald Trump did actually go through the whole primary process. He did have opponents, and so there was a bit of that element, but I think it was mainly just the fact that Harris did not separate herself from the administration and the dissatisfaction of the administration, whereas Trump successfully targeted Harris on that issue. He definitely utilized press events generally pretty well. I mean, both sides generally had their odd gaffes, but it was generally this feeling around the economy that, in my view, drove voters to vote for Donald Trump. And I'm not going to chime in about my opinions on that, whether I think it was a good or bad thing, because that's not my place. But whatever it was, and however you feel about this, I think it's a really interesting election, and I think it tells a lot about politics in general and how incumbents struggle in this sort of climate. So that was very interesting. Anyway, I've been talking for a while now, but now it is time to hear from my viewers. So some of you have sent me some questions that I am more than happy to answer. So let's get started. So the first question was from the comments section of my last video, and it is, do you think coalition governments are more democratic and work better for the electorate than large majority governments who have virtually no opposition and, yes, can get things done, but can also lurch to extremism without restraint? That's quite an interesting one, and that's one I've been thinking about ever since I've read it. And it really depends on what your take of democratic is, because on the one hand you could argue that coalition governments lead to kingmakers. They lead to tiny parties that have very little mandate, able to sway much bigger parties in a completely different direction to the much larger party that generally is seen to have a bigger mandate. But you could also argue that by giving that larger party that still doesn't have the 50% support that it would usually take for a party to win under a proportional system, that could lead to an issue of minority rule, and that kind of poses its own problems. And it also really depends a lot on the types of checks and balances that your system has. But generally speaking, coalition governments do tend to allow for a wider range of voices, and do tend to allow for parties to sort of have a check on the other. So, we had 2010 to 2015 in the UK, we had the Lib Dem Tory coalition. Europe, lots of European countries have coalition partners or coalition governments, and those tend to have a better balance, but it does bring into issues of instability. But it really depends whether or not you think kingmakers are democratic, and it also depends on whether or not it's better to have a more unstable system, because coalitions do collapse. But as we've also seen, majority governments can struggle and face divisions that lead to things like snap elections, though that tends to be a lot more rare. So I'd say it's definitely a very complex question, and I definitely don't want to come across as politically biased one way or another in my answer. I'm just sort of weighing up the pros and cons. But objectively speaking, between a party winning a minority of the vote but having a huge majority or just a majority in general, generally speaking, it would probably be more democratic to have a bunch of medium-sized parties, all with a seat share that's roughly proportionate to their vote share, and have them sort of form the government as a result. But it is certainly a very complex issue. I certainly don't think it is as simple as a yes or no, because there's lots of caveats involved, lots of things to take into consideration. But it is definitely something to consider, because the voting system we use in a democracy is really important, and different voting systems, even different forms of proportional representation, can generate very different results, and it is definitely a very important thing to consider. So thank you for the question. It's a really interesting one, and I'd say generally yes, but it's complicated. There's a lot of caveats. So, second question. What do you think is the best way to go about gathering information, and how do you analyze polling data? So, this is a very interesting one, and I think it's a very important one to think about. In terms of gathering information, I've generally found that I don't always trust online surveys, ones where you fill it out virtually, at least ones where they're completely open to members of the public, because I think they are susceptible to things like bots, and it is often a little more difficult to get reliable information. Generally speaking, I think that most pollsters tend to use either collection via phone or via email, or sometimes in-person interviews, but usually via phone, and occasionally online surveys. And those, I'd say the phone calls tend to be the best, because they allow for proper conversations and in-depth discussion. And it also guarantees that you're at least speaking to someone and not have issues of things like AI bots that maybe want to skew the poll result one way or the other. So how do I analyze polling data? Well, what I do is I look at the crosstabs of various polls. I compare them. I compare what are all these polls saying, what's the consistent elements, and what is maybe a little more inconsistent. I generally tend to go with more reliable ones, so I am generally quite open to using most polls, but I sometimes avoid using certain pollsters. Trafalgar's kind of the main one because they don't publish their crosstabs. But I think most polls do publish their crosstabs, and I think it's really good just to be able to see their data, and it tends to be that most of them follow the same practices. So what I do is I compare them. I compare them to previous elections. So what's the big swing? I look at the demographic data, so which different demographic groups are voting different ways, and how does that compare to how they previously voted. And I would say that the best type of poll by far is the MRP polls. I think they are absolutely superb because they break down demographic and geographic data as well as the raw polling data, and they take a lot of that into account. And they also have a bigger sample size, which leads to generally a smaller margin of error. So that's what I do, and it's good to look at different pollsters, look at what they're saying, look at how they compare. What are they saying that's consistent, and what are they saying that's inconsistent? And if it's consistent or inconsistent, either or, you need to look at why. So why is it that demographic X is voting this way but not that way? And why? And say why did demographic Y suddenly change from voting this way to voting that way? So that's a lot of things to consider, and it's also important to consider satisfaction levels. So how satisfied do people feel about both their government and politics more generally, as that can sometimes help gauge turnout a little bit. So it tends to be that countries with very dissatisfied people, who are dissatisfied at politics and at their government, that can either lead to low turnout or it can lead to something called negative partisanship. So, and negative partisanship is where you turn out to vote for a party, not because you want the party, but because you want the other person out of office. And that term gets thrown around a lot in the US because there's a lot of dissatisfaction with both the Democrats and Republicans. And so a lot of people are annoyed at both parties, but generally see one as the lesser of two evils, so to speak. So that's also something to consider, because turnout can often affect the results. So thank you for the question. It is definitely a very interesting thing to talk about. Sort of how do we gather information? How do we could we utilize AI to make the process easier, or at least to be able to compile lots of different polls into or compile them sort of like an aggregate. So we could use that for we could use AI for that purpose. And the other thing I'd say is also look at the aggregates and look at the polling averages, because those tend to be more reliable than any individual poll. So that's also what I'd say. So yes, thank you for the question. It's a really good one. And finally, we have another question. What do you think will happen in the German Bundestag election in February? Will the FDP reach the 5% threshold to get into the Bundestag? So that's the Free Democrats. Will either the SPD or the Greens have a chance to be the Chancellor or party, or the Chancellor party? Yeah. So that is a very interesting one. So do I think the FDP, the Free Democratic Party, do I think they'll reach the 5% threshold? That's up in the air right now, I'd say, because they're just straddling below that, I think, at about 4% on Politico's poll aggregator. I just realised I think I said January when referring to the German election. No, it's February. So yes, the FDP could get to 5%, but it's going to be very difficult because they are currently at 4% and they don't hold any constituencies, which means they could be completely obliterated on the parliamentary level. So that's going to be a very interesting one. And if the FPD end up losing their representation in Parliament, that will make it very hard for the SPD or the Greens to get to a majority in Parliament. Almost certainly they'll either need to include the left, Die Linke, and the BSW. They'd need to include one of those, and but that probably wouldn't get them the majority they need. So I struggle to see any coalition scenario without the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU. So, because I would be surprised if the AfD and the SPD join together, especially with the Greens. I think generally those parties tend to be pretty opposed in ideology. I think that's an understatement to say the least. But I would say that unless basically every opposition party got together, I'd be very surprised if there was any coalition without the CDU ending up on top. And I would say probably that the next Chancellor of Germany will be from the CDU. So that's generally my thoughts. Now the question isn't necessarily is it going to be which party is going to be the Chancellor party. The question is which parties are going to be in the coalition, because I can see a few scenarios here. So I can see possibly a CDU Green Alliance, perhaps. Maybe not the most likely, but I could see that, and I could also see the CDU and the SPD getting together and forming a coalition like they did before the last election. That's a possibility. Whether or not the CDU go with the AfD is going to be a bit of a question, because generally the CDU have not been that open to working with the AfD because they're generally quite hard right, and the CDU aren't particular fans necessarily of all of the AfD's policies, but there are elements of the CDU who seem to be more open to working with the AfD. So that's going to be the question. And I think the CDU are probably going to look and say, the AfD, before we even consider talking to them, let's see how well they do in the parliament. And let's see how well the other parties do as well. That's pretty much with any coalition building. You always want to wait till the election's already over and done with before you talk about who are you going to join, who's going to be part of your coalition, who you're going to say absolutely not, because the fact is that elections almost always... With elections, it's sort of like it's sort of like a weird sort of version of Sturgeon's law. You can either please some people some of the time, but you can never please everyone all the time, because with elections there's always winners and losers. I'd say that's the rule that people should remember with elections, and should always remember when they react to elections, is that always, and I mean always, in a democratic election that's free and fair, there is going to be a party that's going to lose and a party that's going to win. And with America, that's the Democrats or the Republicans. One of them is going to be the loser, and one of them is going to be the winner. And which one that is up to the electorate. It's their choice, and that should and almost always is respected. So that's really my take on it. I would be surprised, because the SPD are currently in third, behind both the AfD and the CDU. So they still have time to mount a comeback. The election is just under 3 months away. So they do have time to mount a comeback, but it's going to be very difficult. They are on 15% at the Politico aggregate. The AfD's on 19%, and the CDU's all the way up on 32%. And what the parties are all going to be calculating, who's gonna come out on top, who's going to have more seats, and will that be enough to form a stable majority? And are these parties going to be able to work together? Because the other question is, if the CDU decide to go the AfD, how are they going to balance out their more moderate elements who might not like or might oppose some of the AfD's more radical policies? Meanwhile, if they went with the SPD or the Greens, how would their more right-wing element deal with going into power with a left-wing party? And that's going to be the real the factors to watch out. But it is a really good question. So thank you very much for the question. I hope I have answered all of these questions in a good way, because I've probably rambled quite a lot. I hope that I haven't rambled too much, and that my my answers have been easy enough to follow. So, for everyone who's sent a question, thank you so much. I do love engaging. I do love engaging with my viewers, and I do think I should probably do more of these. A part of me is open to trying live streams, but I think I'd need to wait to build up my base a bit more before doing that. But this has been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed it so far. Anyway, I think I've given most of the thoughts that I need to give. So there are some upcoming elections. There is the Irish election. that's happening today, by sheer coincidence. Sinn Féin are looking like they are probably not going to be able to get into government. Possibly. I wouldn't rule it out, but the two main parties, the two other main parties are both ahead of Sinn Féin by a small margin. So Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, I believe. Please do tell me if I've butchered the pronunciation of those names. It's looking like they are probably going to end up in the lead, but with single transferable vote. That's the system they use. They use a proportional single transferable vote. That can often lead to a bit of an unpredictable result, because you also have to factor in transfers. So how many Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil voters are going to transfer to Sinn Féin, and how many of the smaller parties, so like the Labour Party, the Social Democrats, onto the Greens, People Before Profit, and the various independents. How are they going to transfer? Are they going to transfer to Sinn Féin, or are they going to be more favourable to the incumbent, the biggest incumbent parties? Because Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, they went into coalition together to keep Sinn Féin out of government. And it's whether or not they're successful in that the second time around, and whether or not the transfers are more favourable to them or to Sinn Féin. So that's generally my take on that, and we will find out very, very soon. So that's going to be exciting. Definitely going to do a video on that. And we also have the election in Germany, of course. I think I've talked a lot about that. Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, called a general election after the coalition collapsed, and the Social Democrats are looking like they're going to lose pretty big. The question now is who gets to be in the coalition. Do the FPD recover? Do they get over 5%? Because right now they're about 4%. Because the threshold for getting into the parliament is 5% for the regional seats. So that's a question to consider. What role does the BSW play? And if the CDU ends up the biggest party, who are they going to go to coalition with? And we also have the Romanian election. So that is very soon, and it's a pretty interesting race between various different parties. So we have the Social Democrats, the more conservative Alliance for the Unity of Romanians, and we also have various other smaller parties. So coalition building is going to be a lot of fun, with a lot of different political ideologies. I think that it's going to be a very once the year is over, looking back on this year, it is going to be a very interesting year of elections to look back on and to reflect from. But I think that this sort of ties into the final point I want to make about this channel, and that is that I think that the message I really want to share with this channel is the importance of voting. I believe that no matter what your political allegiance is, you should turn out to vote and have your voice heard. And I believe that for a number of reasons, but the main reason is that I think democracy is a really important part of our society, and I think that it is important to hold politicians to account, and voting is the best way to do that. So, and I think that because I believe it leads to better government, it leads to political system that listens more to its voters, and I think that's just a really important thing to have in a democracy. So, wherever you are, whatever your political affiliation is, whatever you believe in, or whatever party you want to see in power in your country, I would absolutely encourage you to vote, because it is a very fundamental right of our democracy, and it should not be taken for granted. So, if you've made it this far in the video, thank you very much. I've been talking for a while. This is the longest video I've ever made. Lost track of time, but I feel really passionately about this, and I hope that, I know there are other people who feel the same. And, it pleases me to see just how many people have engaged with this channel, how many people have subscribed, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for subscribing, and continue to comment, continue to like. I'm going to be making videos like this for a while, so thank you. That's really all I have to say. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.